Push a wheelbarrow to Broken Hill. Test your endurance, test your skill. With a pick and shovel and an old crowbar, and a billy wrapped up in a blanket. Put your men through the toughest test, half a dozen of the very best. The team to beat is from the west, from Borough through to Broken Hill. You gotta be fit or the heat will kill. The man with the flag and the paint on his shirt loves this town like his mother. Chapter 20. Put your men through the toughest test. My music has taken me from east to west and north to south in this amazing continent. All along the way, it's often the people I've met who have given me the inspiration for my songs. They are as diverse and as interesting as the landscape itself. In January 1985, I was booked to put on a show at Burra, an old copper and zinc mining town about 160 kilometres north of Adelaide in South Australia. It was to celebrate the beginning of the Wheelbarrow Push, a tortuous race over more than 300 kilometres from Borough to Broken Hill, the isolated mining town in far west New South Wales. The event commemorated what the miners did when the mines closed down in Borough, while Broken Hill was just opening up as a mining town. These early miners piled their worldly possessions into a wheelbarrow and walked all the way to Broken Hill. So the wheelbarrows in the race had what those old miners might have had in theirs, a pick and shovel, a crowbar, a billy and a blanket. Although the modern wheelbarrows had rubber tyres and the gear was all tied down with gaffer tape. This is how it works. A team of 6 people share the pushing of the barrow. They push it at a 3/4 sprint pace and change over on the run. While the one with the barrow is running, the other 5 line up on a running board of the side of a small truck. From memory, each runner goes for about 200 metres, hands over the barrow at the breakneck pace and jumps back onto the truck at the end of the queue. This is no mean feat. I tried jumping off at half their pace and went arse over head, rolling over a couple of times, then ending up on my feet with camera undamaged, but my pride hurt. You really had to hit the ground running. I got to know one of the teams, the Dampier Salt Shakers from Western Australia, who were the unbeaten champions. They trained in Dampier on the salt fields. They were a great bunch of fellas. They gave me their wheelbarrow, crowbar and all as a gift. The wheelbarrows in Western Australian races aren't actually normal barrows but special racing versions. The team thought I should take it rather than lugging it back to Western Australia. I kept it unused in my shed for years, but temptation finally got the better of me, and it's my current wood barrow at Springbrook. It's galvanised and very reliable. The team should be pleased to know that all the tools and billy have been put to good use too. It still has the sponsor's stickers on it, so I haven't forgotten where it came from. The team featured in my song too. The prize money of $10,000 was given to the team's favourite charity. Apparently the race still exists in Western Australia, but people eventually found the Burra Broken Hill race a bit too arduous. Our famous Australian painter, Pro Hart from Broken Hill, traditionally started the race with the Australian flag. This particular year, however, the honour went to me. The race was over 3 days, so I had to do it each day. I was honoured to get to know Pro Hart on that trip. He took me for a ride in his big Rolls Royce to the local fish and chip shop. It's incongruous to see a Rolls Royce in a place like Broken Hill. We bought yabbies instead of prawns. What a delight. The wheelbarrow race and Pro inspired me to write the song Paint Me a Wheelbarrow, which was on the Mallyboy album. After the album was released, I sent a copy to Pro with a note to say that I was also a painter of sorts and that the song was dedicated to him. Soon after, in the mail, came a painting by Pro of the wheelbarrow race. What a treasure that is for me. I love Pro. Pro was an original in thought and talent. I remember how he supported the innocence of Lindy Chamberlain in the case of the death of her daughter Rosaria and painted a haunting picture of her trial. I guess that painting would be worth a lot of money now. I saw it recently in his gallery at Broken Hill, and was amazed that the gallery guide didn't even explain its significance. Pro portrayed Lindy as a little girl to underline the prejudice that surrounded her trial. She had little hope because of the power of the opinion of the general public at the time. It was quite different to his usual paintings of mallee trees. Pro had also invested a lot of money in painters such as Rembrandt. He was no fool. His gallery in Broken Hill is still definitely worth a visit. In March 2006, a week before Pro died, I visited him for the last time. He was unable to talk, but he seemed to know who I was. I kissed him on the head and left his home in tears. He was a great Australian and a generous soul. Now the woman was a mighty cook, very white across the bum. The station kids, black and white, were allowed to call her mum. Her kitchen was a bakery for an outback appetite for big slabs of bully beef or good old Vegemite. Some of the men were bachelors, some of them were not. It didn't worry the station cook, she'd feed the bloody lot. Visitors from the Isa or tourists in a bus with a huge pot of strong tea and a minimum of fuss. Now the station pet was a Brahman bull. You could pat him on the head. He'd never seen a sale yard. He was station bred. I tried to take his picture with a stockman and a gin, but they faded into the scenery with a drought-resistant grin. To the famous brunette races, they'd head off for the fun. Where the beer flowed like a river, there was Coke and Bundy rum. The station boys were favourites to win the tug-of-war. The townies weren't prepared to risk another broken jaw. It's the last of the outback stations owned by a family, hard fought by a pioneer of the Northern Territory. I hope it won't be swallowed up by a public company and fade into the heat haze of outback history. In 1989, I met a veterinary surgeon nicknamed Sundown Doug at Mount Isa, a city in the Gulf Country region of Queensland. He offered me a seat in his Cessna to fly to Malapunya Springs, where he had to test some cattle for tuberculosis. What an offer, to fly over the border between Queensland and the Northern Territory to a family-owned station. Our fuel stop was at Cape Crawford, where the pub is known as Heartbreak Hotel. The pub is over 100 kilometres southwest of Borroloola, at the junction of the Carpentaria and Tableland highways. There I met a helimuster pilot filling in time between jobs. Doug was quite prepared to wait at the pub and drink lemonade while the chopper pilot quickly whisked me out to what they call the Lost City. It is a natural phenomenon of columns of sandstone sculptured by time. From the air it looks like a miniature high-rise city. As usual, with helimuster pilots, he had no fear, clipping the tops of bloodwood trees to get a very close view of the scenery. We landed at the Lost City and wandered around for about 20 minutes while the helicopter engine kept running. "I don't want to stop it," the pilot said. "It might not start again." I guess I'm a bit of a fatalist taking such rides. If the motor conks out, helicopters will float down from a good height as the blades will spin and soften the blow. But this was not a good height. Fortunately, we returned to the Heartbreak Hotel in one piece. Off we flew again to Malapunya Springs Station. The Darcy brothers owned the station. Their father was one of the first carriers out that way with a big old truck transporting cattle and supplies for the stations. The cattle had all been yarded in preparation for Doug's arrival. What a sight from the air, cattle and men on horseback amid swirling dust. "Here comes Sundown," they were saying. Apparently they called him Sundown because he was notorious for landing his plane on station landing strips when it was dangerously late. It's generally considered foolish to land when there are no landing lights on the airstrip because you could easily run into a kangaroo or a cow. I can understand how that might happen. But in those remote areas, it's often hard to predict arrival times with the changeable weather conditions and fairly casual fuel stops. So if you mistime it, there's not much choice but to fly on. The first thing we did when we landed was to meet the stockman. The black blokes sat with their saddles a short distance from the Darcys, all in good humour. The camp cook was one of the Darcys' daughters, a woman in her 60s who had come home to help with the muster. I wish I'd asked more about her life. I sat nearby watching, amazed at her ability to cook corned beef and veggies over a dead tree burning at one end. She knew exactly how much hot coals everything needed. It was obvious she had done it all her life. The atmosphere will always be with me, and it gave me another song, Station Cook, for the Warrigal album. I've seen many great stock campfires in my time, and this was one of the best. At Smoko, one of the Darcys, I think his nickname was Mugger, sipped on a mug of tea. I remarked that the enamel mug he was using was more like a saucepan, though in his huge hand it was quite in proportion. He said, "Very handy when they're passing around the rum, mate. You say, just a couple of fingers in the bottom will do, thanks." I stayed mainly out of the way at the stockyard, as the cattle were very annoyed at being yarded. They were not at all used to being so close to humans. If you weren't nimble, you could easily break a leg or arm or a rib if you got in their way. All day the men were lurching up onto the yard rails to avoid being crushed. When the cattle had all been tested and dabbed with silver paint, Doug and I headed back to the station to meet the other sister and her husband George. George had his own little pad outside the kitchen and didn't seem to be a part of the working station. He certainly didn't look as useful as the big strapping brothers. His wife wasn't a small woman either, but she seemed almost insignificant standing in the huge kitchen, big enough to cater for a busload. We wandered out into the yard and met the family pet Brahman bull. The mango trees up there were the biggest I've seen, as tall as gum trees. What an eventful day, and we had yet to fly back to the Barclay Homestead Roadhouse. The day was starting to dim, and I began thinking about Doug's nickname. He'd gone fairly quiet when I decided to tap him on the shoulder. He had headphones on and I didn't, to ask him how much further it was. He literally nearly hit the roof with fright. Shit, I thought. He's worried about landing in the dark. Then he radioed the roadhouse to ask them to drive out onto the airstrip to guide him in and chase away the animals. When we landed, I was out in a flash so he could immediately take off again and head back to the Isa. I made my first trip to Kakadu in the late 80s. It was truly amazing. We flew from Darwin over the jungle and landed on an airstrip cut into the thick scrub. A good bloke with a white beard was running a small holiday camp owned by a mob from an island off the coast. Apparently the indigenous owners had their own people running it, but all they did was tear it up with four-wheel drives and not respect its value. I'll never forget what we were shown. There was a rocky outcrop in the water, completely white from bird shit, with Nankeen night herons by the hundreds flying around it. That struck me as weird, because they were night herons. We were shown a cave with a mummified corpse wrapped up inside it. It was an area that very few people get to see, so I felt lucky to be there. That day, we were also taken by boat through the swampy country. The little jacana birds with red heads hopping from one floating lily leaf to another were fascinating, not to mention the sea eagle that swooped down and snatched a large snake from the water. Amazing. The thing I remember most was meeting Long Peter. He arrived with an elder to have a barbecue and lots of beer. Long Peter was so ancient-looking I could barely look at him for fear of the unknown. He really enjoyed a can of beer, which he called a green one, a VB, Victoria Bitter. At one stage he grabbed a piece of PVC pipe and played didgeridoo with it. I was dying to capture this portrait of him, but his presence was so overwhelming that I was afraid he wouldn't approve. So I took a photo when he wasn't looking. I guess he was at least 200 centimetres, 6'7" tall. He proved to me that some Indigenous people can handle grog, because when all the green ones are gone, he asked for a red one, a Melbourne Bitter. Our host was well prepared as the beer kept flowing. I woke the next morning with my tent mate complaining about my snoring. I'd drunk more beer than I should have. But nothing ever puts me off breakfast, no matter how crook I feel. Much to my amazement, I saw Long Peter wandering around the bush with a blue one in his hand. I thought, well, I'll be buggered. On the same trip, the crew and I went up the Alligator River with some Asian Aborigines who looked like Maoris, hoping to catch barramundi. The Alligator River is full of crocodiles, not alligators. I guess the early explorers didn't know the difference, and I can't remember either. Is it something to do with the mouth? Anyway, we didn't catch any barra, but we saw lots of crocs and drank plenty of green ones. A few times the water was quite shallow, so a couple of us got out and pushed the boat. That was quite exciting, as you can imagine. Another time at Kakadu, Mary Kay and I were invited to go buffalo hunting with a fella who believed he was the real Crocodile Dundee. Buffaloes were on the increase, so quite a few people made money out of buffalo meat. Rod Ansell was the fella's name. The Darwin police hunted him down a few years later as he'd gone a bit crazy. That was a tragedy, as he had a beautiful wife and 3 great little kids who were prepared to live out their dad's fantasy of being the most bushy on the planet. He was into survival and all that stuff. We sat around their table and had billy tea even though we weren't around a campfire. I remember we all went tearing down the road side by side to avoid the dust to a mining road. We arrived at the swampy country and met his wild-looking mates. Dundee, as we called him, invited me into his open jeep and we drove to a spot on the water to admire the geese and pelicans and corellas flying across the Kakadu country. To my surprise, he pulled out a joint. I thought, why not? We tore off with a buffalo catcher on the side and headed towards the buffaloes. The catcher consisted of 2 steel prongs that were designed to catch the buffalo behind the ears. The buffalo we chased was elusive, but we wore the poor bugger out and eventually he succumbed to the catcher. I thought it was quite cruel. The animal must have almost been dead with exhaustion by the time they tied a heavy rope around his horns and dragged him up the ramp into a truck by throwing the rope over the cabin of the truck, through a pulley, and the jeep did the rest. I've castrated calves and had to handle cattle and sheep on the land, so nothing surprises me, but I found this method of handling buffaloes quite disturbing. However, we were taken into some real Northern Territory bush where the bird life was unbelievable. The Territory leaves a lasting impression on you. It's incredibly diverse. Amazing Day came out of this trip. It gave me another song for Warrigal. Bill the Cat also ended up on Warrigal. While most of the songs on that album are inspired by my experiences in the bush, particularly in the Northern Territory, I've always thought that humour has a place on an album, if it's the right song. I have to thank Neil Young for this song. I've always thought of Neil Young as a folk singer. He has a plaintive tenor voice that seems to give his songs drama, even if there is no drama in the lyrics. Neil Diamond does this too. He can make a wooden table sound monumental. I was delighted when I went to Neil Young's concert in the late 80s and he came out on stage, just him and his guitar, with his harmonica soaking in a cup of hot water to make the reeds bend more. He probably had musicians behind him, but they didn't matter. He played his hits that could be described as white man's blues. During interval, all this scaffolding was erected. Industrial noises were coming through the sound system. Then on came Neil with a heavy metal band. We were out of there like a shot. We came to hear the Neil Young we loved. I'm not into heavy metal, especially sung by a folk singer. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with metal, it's just not my thing. I'm a bush boy. Metal's a city thing, I reckon. That night when we got home, I slept on the couch. I'm not sure why. Perhaps I'd had a few drinks and I'd nodded off. When I woke, I had a blues kind of melody in my head. It was definitely with a rhythm I'd heard Neil Young play the night before. God knows why, but I started writing Bill the Cat, one of my biggest novelty hits. There was definitely a purpose behind the lyrics. I get very annoyed about dogs having to be kept inside your suburban fence, while cats have the privilege of roaming through the neighbourhood, killing birds at any opportunity. Feral cats are diminishing our native bush and animals, probably because people dump kittens in the bush. They don't take responsibility for having the cats spayed or taking them to a cat protection centre, or dare I say it, knocking them on the head. My mother always had cats because she was petrified of snakes, but she left it up to me to take care of the frequent kitty litters. I know a lot of people adore cats, but I'm afraid I just don't understand the animal. On the land, of course, having dogs was the norm, but I won't have one now because it would chase the goannas and paddymellons, the very small wallabies, away from our cottage on the edge of the forest. Boogie with My Baby also found its way onto Warrigal, and both of these are still regularly requested at my shows. Boogie comes and goes on the set list. Many of my audience remember those old dance hall scenarios back in the 50s. Bill the Cat, I'm pleased to say, is well and truly back in my show now. It's the only blues song I play. I can play blues harp style on the harmonica, and Cole Watson can have fun on his slide guitar. Even Dave Ellis plays a bit of blues on the bull fiddle bass. It's been a great way to renew the song, approaching it from a different musical level. The audience love it, especially the kids. It's funny how people love to really sing out balls in the chorus. I've played blues harp on many of my songs, but the songs themselves aren't really blues. Buried in My Bedclothes, Mates Around the Fire, and I'm a Basher are good examples of what I mean. Just in case you don't understand how blues harp is played, I should explain. You use a harmonica in the key that is a fourth above the key the song is in. For example, in I'll Be Gone, I play an F harp for the key of C. If I'm in G, I play a C harp. You'll find that most of the notes you need are when you are drawing on the harp, sucking. This allows you to restrict the air with your lips and force the reeds to bend. It's possible to get 4 notes out of one reed. That way you can slide the note like a trombone. Warrigal went triple platinum in 1989, the year it was released, and reached number 1 on the general ARIA charts. It was also Album of the Year in 1990 at the Country Music Awards.